Thanks, and thanks for sitting through the whole day and actually staying here to listen to me drone on here at the very end. I'll try to keep it quick and fun, so hopefully we'll have a good time. I'd like to start with a quote from Plato, one of everybody's favorite philosophers, that I hope will get us in the right mindset. Music gives a soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and life to everything. And today we're going to be focusing on music, imagination, and just a little bit of AI. And I know the hype train is real and it's clearly left the station, but we're just going to dig into it for a little bit. And this talk isn't about how to integrate a chatbot into your app. There's dozens of tutorials out there for that. It's about my journey building an imagination-powered music recommendation system, and we'll get into what that means in a little bit. Some lessons I learned along the way, and things that I hope will help you think about working with generative AI in a different way, because the world already has enough chatbots. Uh-oh. Sorry, I think I turned the screen off. Oh, there we go. Hey there, my name's Eric. I'm a developer advocate at Datadog. I love my doggo Judge and my fiance Priyanka. We love to travel, and I like to imagine that I'm a travel photographer. I also love to cook, and I watch The Bear, so now I also like to imagine that I'm a chef. But more than anything, except for Judge and Priyanka, of course, I love music. For as long as I can remember, I've felt this craving for it, this need for it, but I have absolutely no musical talent. So I'm only able to pursue that love by listening to it. And at some point, this turned into more of a quest to find new music than actually enjoying the music that I'd already found. And I'm sure that probably says something about me, but that's a topic for a different conference. And with over 120,000 songs released every day, finding new music that resonates with you can be a challenge. That's just a staggering amount of content. There have been many attempts from people much smarter and more qualified than me to tackle this problem. So here's a few of the highlights. The Music Genome Project, which is the underlying categorization system behind Pandora's radio stations, was once the bleeding edge of algorithmic recommendations. But after almost 2 decades of streaming, Pandora stations can turn into a bit of an echo chamber. They mimic the issue of traditional radio where they play the same songs over and over. RDO streaming service had its heavy rotation playlist, which was made up of songs your friends had on repeat, which is an awesome and also just classic way to discover new music. There's also this one thing at a time where you could drop in on your friend's listening session and they could just DJ your day for you, which was super cool. Eventually it filed for bankruptcy. Pandora acquired what was left of it. Weather Jams was an app that I convinced the design firm I worked at to build. It recommended music based on the weather. There weren't any fancy algorithms. I just listened to hundreds of playlists on this service called 8Tracks, chose a few common tags that seemed like they'd fit with each weather condition, and wired it all up. Geez, sorry, I keep hitting the podium. 10 years later, a few marketing images like this one and an ill-conceived and over-engineered jQuery plugin are really all that's left of it. I think a song a day might have been the pinnacle of music recommendations in the digital age. In this sea of algorithms, there was this truly human and truly unscalable approach. A music-loving curator would email you a new track every weekday morning, so you could sip your coffee, start the day with a new song. It was super cool, and I wish I had used and appreciated it more while it lasted. Discover Weekly is a dynamically generated playlist from Spotify based on comparing your liked songs to all the other liked songs of users across the Spotify musicverse and finding the Venn diagram of overlaps, suggesting some things that might be cool for you. People loved it when it first came out. People still love it most of the time, but after a decade of weekly playlists, sentiment waxes and wanes. My own Discover Weekly ends up delivering more hits or more misses than hits these days, I found. And then in February, Spotify introduced its DJ AI to the world, digs through your listening and creates this stream of music based on your habits. It's a really interesting approach, but it currently has at least 2 glaring flaws, I think. It starts every session like you've never, ever listened to it before, and it's completely deterministic each day. So if you switch out of a DJ session, come back to it, you enter into this uncanny valley where it starts to feel like you're talking to an NPC in Skyrim or something instead of experiencing the future of music. And with so much new music to deal with, I can't blame any of these approaches for not being perfect. To me, the best recommendations hadn't been based on some deep analysis of the BPM, danceability, or tonality of a track. Those are all things that can be analyzed pretty easily. They came from a more human understanding of how a track feels, the underlying poetry of the lyrics, the vibe of the vocalist, and that stuff's not intangible, but it's definitely hard to define, especially programmatically. And I think that requires some imagination. So now I'd like to dig into sort of abstract, nebulous thing that you could call the imagination of a language model like ChatGPT, and my attempts to harness that to generate music recommendations. A couple of quick disclaimers so nobody gets too mad at me. I am not an AI expert. I'm just a dude with a lot of curiosity, probably too much time, and I like to play around with stuff. I will be simplifying things. I don't think a deep understanding is necessary for what we're talking about today, so I've simplified some stuff to make it a little easier to talk about and hopefully a little more enjoyable to listen to. and I'll be anthropomorphizing. I know logically that these language models are just programs doing what programs do, but there's also something really interesting about what they can do. So I'm gonna say a few things to humanize them, and if any of that's not your jam, I encourage you to listen with an open mind, and then we can chat about it after. Okay, back to the fun stuff. Last year, ChatGPT arrived, and it was kind of a big deal. I assume everybody's probably heard of it. You're at a tech conference. If you haven't, we can sync up after, and I'll tell you all about it too. People are doing all kinds of cool stuff with it, like having it pretend to be a Linux terminal. And the article that this comes from is 100% worth a read, by the way. Here's a link if you want to snag it. I will also drop some links in the Discord after. I'm going to sip water while it's up in case anybody wants to get it out. Cool. Or an old school text adventure game. Or, and I'm sorry, I couldn't find a good screenshot for this one, using it to create a dynamic honeypot that responds with what it thinks an attacker wants, just wasting a would-be attacker's time and CPU cycles, which is like the coolest use case for this technology that I've ever heard of. Being a clever person myself, I was compelled to test the limits of its creativity by having it answer mundane questions as fictional characters. And when that finally got boring, which I'll admit took longer than it should have, I started to get it to give me music recommendations. There were some immediate challenges though. It would frequently just make up songs that sounded real but didn't exist. And then when I called it out, sometimes I would get more songs that didn't exist, or it would just double down on its original lie and insist that those songs were real. Sometimes though, the recommendations were so perfect that I felt compelled to capture them. This pasta party playlist it gave me still slaps if you're cooking noodles. So I started to explore how I could work with ChatGPT to create something new, something I'm calling BeatBrain. It's a music recommendation system powered by ChatGPT. Oh my, go? There we go, sorry, I didn't click. Seeing an early iteration of it generate this hipster coffee shop playlist and save it to my Spotify felt like I was in the future of music. I'll leave one more second in case anyone wants to grab that one too. Okay, so let's break down how BeatBrain works. And that avatar is from another generative AI called Crayon, and that's with an AIY instead of AY. It's super neat if you need some little avatars or images. It makes really, really cool stuff. So BeatBrain's a web app. It's built with Next.js, which I'm sure many of you know and love. It's database and authentication are handled by Supabase, which is basically Firebase built on open source tools. It's like a really awesome layer on top of Postgres, and it helps you manage your application's data infrastructure, authentication, authorization, all that fun stuff that I never want to actually deal with. And it's hosted on Vercel because automated deployments of Next.js to Vercel is just like a breath of fresh air, and I just want to write some code to put out in the world. And BeatBrain, like many projects being created right now, is a web app with a ChatGPT integration. But I didn't want the user to chat with BeatBrain. I wanted it to just work. And you might be familiar with Maslow's hammer. It's the adage that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that idea applies to how we're approaching generative AI right now. If all you have is a chatbot, everything looks like a conversation. I think I'm going to call that ChatGPT's hammer. And unfortunately, I think for maybe even most use cases, conversations are actually just a bad interface. Like they're complicated, they're layered with all this meaning, there are things that are inferred, things that are implied. Sometimes you leave things unsaid but expect them to be understood. And when I say they're bad interfaces, I'm talking about user interfaces, of course. Like, as a user, there are times where I'd want to type my thoughts and have something just react to it. But I also don't know anyone who's ever thankful that a company's support chat was a bot, or was super excited when they called and a robot picks up. And generally, people don't want to interact with a program that masquerades as this capable, intelligent system that's there to help you. And I'm also talking about programmatic interfaces. That free-flowing back and forth exchange of natural language does not lend itself to structured, consistent data and doing things programmatically. Has anyone here ever had to parse a response from a service that didn't have a guaranteed structure? Anyone? I see one. How fun was that? It sucks, right? It's terrible. No one wants to do that. So if you're trying to do something like augment the information in a model's response with links, or send some portion of the user's request to an external API, there's going to be some overhead parsing that back out of this natural language series of paragraphs that it gives you. And if you only take one thing away from this talk, I hope it's this. You may not need a conversation. Just because these models are designed around language, your users don't have to chat with them. You can imagine other possibilities. But BeatBrain is also a bot, and it is powered by the OpenAI Chat API, so under the hood, there is a conversation going on. The user just doesn't need to know about it. And let's dig into how that works for a little bit of context. So you've got a user who wants to listen to some music. They interact with the web app via the UI, which does not have a text area or really any inputs at all. And the web app interacts with Spotify via its API to know what the user is listening to and queue up more songs. And the web app also interacts with the BeatBrain bot to get recommendations. And BeatBrain reaches out to OpenAI API with the latest ChatGPT model to make recommendations and provide some commentary to the user about why it chose that song. And that's basically how things are separated and how the control flow is managed. With web app acting as this sort of overarching orchestrator, like a puppeteer pulling all the strings to make everyone talk to each other and work together. And the BeatBrain bot uses its vast and impressive stores of imagination to recommend a new track based on what the user is listening to. But what does imagination even mean in this case? Like, we're talking about a program here, right? Well, because ChatGPT was trained to extrapolate what it thinks should be the next logical word in a conversation based on all of this stuff that we've posted on the internet over the years, I leaned into this hunch that like a lot of people have written about music, and probably a lot of that seeped into the model's training data. And it turns out with the right prompts, we can actually benefit from that information and the associations that it has inside of the model's neural network. So language models like the ones powering ChatGPT rely on what we call prompts to decide what response they should generate. Prompts are just a natural language description of how you want the model to behave. And here's how BeatBrain's prompt starts. You are BeatBrain, the advanced AI assistant for the Music Genome Project, working in partnership with the EchoNest Music Intelligence Platform. And if anyone is here from either of those companies, this is not like an official representation thing. I don't know if that's a legal gray area or whatever, but don't sue me. We want the output to seem like an intelligently programmed and designed AI with access to these advanced, awesome algorithms, right? Because if we were really going to build this system, that's what we would want. And the underlying logic behind the Music Genome Project is like proprietary and super secret. It's what powers Pandora's stations, like I mentioned earlier, but like so much has been written about it, and a lot of that appears to have been picked up in ChatGPT's training data. The EchoNest are like a music intelligence powerhouse. Their tools power Spotify's Discover Weekly playlist, its taste profiles, mood playlists, and used to power all kinds of other stuff until Spotify bought them. And once again, a lot's been written about them, and a lot of it seems to be in the training data. And this partnership would represent like the most epic combination of music analysis resources in the world, and it's exactly what I wish actually existed. So now that we know what BeatBrain model is supposed to think, what the model is supposed to think that BeatBrain is, you might be wondering like, well, how does it come up with recommendations? Like, we could wire up a wrapper on top of Spotify's existing API, but where's the fun in that? That doesn't involve anywhere near enough imagination to be fun. So here's the next sentence in BeatBrain's prompt. Analyze the current Spotify track based on attributes like genre, tempo, instrumentation, lyrics, and mood in order to provide a link to a similar track on Spotify. And you may notice that track tag in there, and that's just angle brackets after many attempts to get consistent, properly formatted responses. I have the web app basically send the track to the users listening to an XML kind of like this, with a track, a song, and an artist. And whether that's necessary or not is totally debatable. I found it helps me get more standardized responses, and then when BeatBrain gives a bunch of analysis about why it's used the track, it'll also wrap the song and artist in those little tags, which makes it really easy to find and replace them with a link to it on Spotify, which is nice. But there are tools out there for that now, and maybe you always just want like JSON instead of prose, because prose is frankly very hard to work with. There's tools like LQML, TypeChat from Microsoft, LangChain's output parsers are really cool. And there's actually one just released on Monday called Outlines. It's for Python right now, but I'm sure eventually, like everything else, it'll come over to our world too. And so what I do is just BeatBrain includes an example of what it wants the bot to give me back, and it kind of follows that. GPT-4 is pretty good about doing that. Older models were kind of janky, and you really needed some tools for it. So that's how we get our recommendations. I like to think of this as imaginary computing in a way. Like, it's super fascinating to me. There's no logic to program. There's no algorithm or complex analysis. Like, you can't leak code this, right? We're just sort of describing what we'd like and having the model give us what it thinks we want. And like, is that perfect? Absolutely not. Is it okay? Most of the time. And every once in a while, it just crushes it, which has left me with this question that I found really hard to answer while I'm working through all this, which is like, is ChatGPT creative? It's certainly written more haikus and short stories than even the most prolific authors at this point. And while probing the depths of its training data, sometimes I'd ask it to like quote some lyrics that were relevant to its recommendation. And it would come up with some convincingly plausible stuff. Like, they were wrong, but they weren't ridiculous. Some of them could easily been on like an early demo recording. You might find them 20 years later on a B-side release. Like, it's possible. And they also have these emergent capabilities, like parsing and decoding the meaning behind emojis, which I'll give you a second to read because this one's pretty neat. And like, math is something that language models are pretty infamous for being bad at, but when you ask them to explain their thought process, the models can actually successfully answer these complex word problems. I hear a few more chuckles, so I'm gonna give it a second because I think some people are just getting it. There we go. And that led me to other questions, like, is ChatGPT adaptive? These capabilities weren't things the models, which were just trained to parse and generate text, were explicitly taught, but they're performing these tasks, and they're actually doing pretty well at it in some cases. And since I already said earlier I'm going to anthropomorphize and simplify stuff, I'm just going to call that imagination. And we give BeatBrain a track, and it uses this awesome fancy imagination, pretending to be this awesome advanced music analysis system, and gives us back another track. And I think that's frankly pretty amazing. But it has some unique challenges. Like the fact that your bot will start with outdated knowledge. There's this thing called a knowledge cutoff, which is like the point at which the training data was created and no more new information is included. ChatGPT's, for example, is around September of 2021, which for some applications doesn't matter. And I'm sure eventually we'll end up with like, greenfield or evergreen models or that have rolling knowledge cutoff updates and stuff like that. We just don't have that yet. And for some applications, you can feed the necessary context in to help it catch up. You can give it search results, you can give it live data from an API, blog post, whatever it is you want to give it. But for something like this, where we would need to give it every song that's been released since September of 2021, that's just like impossible, right? That's too much data to try and fit into it. So we just have to accept that in this case, the app that I designed will just never have new songs right now, which is kind of a bummer, but I think they say like as you get older, you appreciate new music less, so maybe it works out, right? And there's another important thing to consider here, which is something that happens every time BeatBrain reaches out to OpenAI, which is that a lot of tokens have been flying back and forth. And anytime someone talks about language models, tokens come up, but like what are they really? And they're essentially just a unit of meaning in a text. And tokenization is this process of breaking those down into a string of these tokens. And sometimes they can be part of a word. On average, it's like 1.3 tokens per word in the English language. And those tokens get mapped to these IDs that the model uses to identify, connect, and compare them internally. And now that tokens are, understanding like why they matter is easier if we dig deeper into how things work under the hood. It helps if you think about the conversation with the model as sort of a single document of text, which is basically how it works under the hood. I like to use the analogy of a screenplay, where the system provides stage directions and setting info. Here's that first sentence from BeatBrain again. And here it is, broken down to tokens, and this is the last time I'm going to highlight them because it's really distracting, but it's good to see kind of what it looks like with a bunch of stuff there. And if you are curious about tokens, how to calculate and visualize them, gpttokenizer.dev is like the coolest one. Its creator also maintains an NPM package that's like the fastest, most capable and complete JavaScript version we have, because there's no official OpenAI library for JavaScript tokenization yet. So this is the one that's awesome. I would highly recommend it. Again, I'll drop links after too. And go back to our screenplay analogy. Like after the system sets the stage, the user and the bot have this dialogue. And now in BeatBrain's case, the exchange is going to look a little more like this because I'm using like a makeshift API kind of setup, followed by something like this. And that is a markdown code block for the time being. I haven't wired BeatBrain up with LQML or anything like that yet, so it's still dealing with prose. And I truncated the notes on this one to get it to fit, but it said some pretty profound stuff about the two tracks in this one case, which are Gypsy and Landslide. Like this direct quote from the end of that truncated response. If I were to make a mixtape about reminiscing and wrestling with the past, these would be back to back. Yeah, they'd be right there. Which brings me to something I think a lot of people forget about, which is your bot has a voice. And whether you let it respond as a generic model, which is definitely a vibe, or whether you train it to have its own unique voice, which takes some work, or whether, like me, you ask it to emulate a well-known entity, which is maybe an illegal gray area. Again, I'm not a lawyer, please don't sue me. Your bot will have a voice. Use it wisely. In my case, BeatBrain just felt like he should be working at some cyberpunk version of the record store from High Fidelity. So naturally, I asked it to emulate everyone's favorite angsty music lover. Your commentary and notes are written in the voice of Rob Gordon, John Cusack's character from the 2000 film High Fidelity. That's all it took to go from generic sounding model responses like, these tracks were chosen based on their similar acoustic and vocal instrumentation and slow, melancholic moods that fit the theme of the playlist. This sentence is taken from an earlier iteration of BeatBrain, using that same track from the example. And defining BeatBrain's voice turned its responses into something deeper, almost wistful, like this sentence from the truncated part of that JSON I showed earlier. They're like two sides of the same emotional coin, talking about growing up, relationships, life. Oh, there we go. So your bot can sound like every other bot, or it can sound like your bot, who could sound like a bot pretending to be another bot or whatever it is you convince it to pretend to be. Anyway, let's get back to tokens for a minute. The model breaks all these words into tokens when it's processing the document. And tokens are expensive. Even though costs have dropped, it's like 6 cents per 1,000 tokens for GPT-4 right now, I think, they can get expensive if you aren't careful or if your project suddenly takes off. Because tokens are also context. Going back to that screenplay analogy, if you only see one line of dialogue from a play, it might be hard to come up with the most appropriate response for the next line. But if you see everything that's taking place up to that point, it's a lot easier to make an educated guess. And for language models to come up with the next line of dialogue in our conversation, they need to know every line of dialogue and what instructions came before that. And the models don't have a memory, so we have to send every single thing that's been sent before with each request to give it enough context to understand what it's supposed to be doing. Which means that tokens build up as your conversation continues. The number of tokens in each request increases because it includes all the tokens from each previous prompt. And that can quickly turn into a lot of tokens. Which brings me to one of the most interesting things that I learned. Be concise. This small reminder applies in a few different ways. It's just a good reminder that the model has a limited context window, which is like the total amount of tokens it can keep track of reliably. The more verbose you get, the closer you get to exhausting that window, and things get kind of off the rails. But also simpler prompts can lead to more effective and creative responses. When you're trying to put too much logic or too many specifications in place, the responses just aren't as creative, and sometimes they get lost as the conversation goes on anyway, so it becomes sort of useless. It's best to keep it simple. And actually just injecting the imperative, be concise, into your prompt will help the model be more careful with its word choice and reduce the number of items in lists. And according to one study, it can reduce your token usage by like 40 to 90%, which is wild. And now if you played around with or heard about some projects like LangChain, you might have been listening to me talk this whole time and wonder, like, why don't you just make BeatBrain an agent and give it access to Spotify via a tool? And that is a super, super valid question. For those of you who aren't familiar, this would essentially like empower the bot to make its own requests to the Spotify API and do things that it thinks it's supposed to do, which sounds pretty cool. I've tried a few variations of this approach, and in practice, and it might just be that I'm terrible at defining how these tools should be used, what it turns into is a lot of unnecessary API calls, wasting my time, my tokens, and my rate limits. There are some good tools for it, but I have not been able to harness them very well. Maybe you will be able to wield them better than I have. After a lot of testing, I decided it was just more efficient and effective to have my web application act as the controller and let me take control of the whole experience. And let me say there are some tools, and I'll tell you about a couple of them real quick. ChatGPT functions allow you to define a function signature that the model will request that you execute, and it'll give you the parameters it wants you to execute them with. It tells you the function by name and then gives you sort of an object of parameters. LangChain tools turn your model into an agent who can perform actions like sending API requests, gathering search results, depending on which tools you've made available to it. And then AutoGPT is like this idea taken to its extreme, and it turns your bot into this autonomous agent that just like seeks out solutions to a task you give it. It uses a combination of like internet searches and plugins you can wire it up with, and it has a database to keep track of what it learned as it goes along, and it's pretty wild. It's a little overkill for my use case. And going back to ChatGPT's hammer, like most of this tooling assumes you want to build ChatGPT or something like it, a bot that chats with the user. Maybe you give it some bells and whistles like searching text documents or Googling something. And that means they could be more trouble than they're worth, especially if you're trying to avoid a chat interface. And a lot of the tooling also applies these layer of abstractions that just make it really hard for you to understand what's going on with your code and how it actually works. And like any emerging hype-fueled field, there's an impossible amount of tools that are being released basically on a weekly basis. And it's easy to get distracted chasing the latest and greatest, but we're still pretty early in the hype cycle right now, so you don't really need to. But you can build your own tools. Like at some point in the future, I will say that this advice will have aged terribly because we'll have really mature tooling, and it'll sound like I'm telling you to build your own rendering library instead of just using React or something, and I'll sound crazy. But we aren't there just yet, especially in TypeScript and JavaScript land. Like Python gets all the cool new stuff, and we're sort of like, we get it afterwards when it comes to this language model stuff. I spent a lot of time trying to get ChatGPT to like give me the right responses, and that involved talking to it a lot. And then when the API came out, it involved talking to that a lot. And I was super frustrated with how hard it was to compare those responses. So I ended up building a plugin to allow me to actually save those responses to Obsidian, which is a markdown-based note-taking application, where I can tag, categorize, and search them. And I know I spent a lot of time ragging on chats, but you can see I had to build a chat interface for this one right there, which is kind of a bummer, but you need it sometimes. If I were going to rebuild it today, I would probably use something like Versal's AI SDK, which is great for this, especially if you're using Next.js and want to use edge functions. It simplifies the streaming of responses back and forth really, really well. Or Fixie's AI JSX, which if you have used React should look pretty familiar to you. Super, super cool. And using that would let me focus on what's more important, which is saving a conversation to a note, and also managing the memory. And in that case, I'm not talking about RAM or storage. I'm actually talking about that context we talked about earlier, which is like what is included when we send something back to the model. Some implementations will send everything and just hope you never hit the window of the context window. Some will start summarizing after a certain point and dropping stuff, and some will just actually get rid of older messages as they become, your context gets too big. They'll just throw stuff away. And our own memories are malleable, so that kind of makes sense. I tried a few of these different approaches, but none of them felt like they gave me the right amount of control. So I ended up taking matters in my own hands and deciding that the user should be able to decide what happens to those. Core memories will always be included in a context. Remembered memories are included if there's room, and forgotten memories will never be included, which actually gives you a cool way to like test a prompt, forget it, write a new version of it, see what the response would be like if you'd done it the other way. It's super, super fun. And that brings me to something that I think people forget about, which is like, while our initial system prompt sets the stage for interactions the users will have, managing how those interactions may influence future interactions is also super important because it affects how the bot understands the flow of the conversation, which affects what it will predict it should tell you, essentially. And so the last lesson I will leave you with is manage the conversation, even if the user doesn't know it's there. Don't just assume things will work or conversations won't exceed the context limit. Come up with a plan to manage the memory. And there's many approaches, just find the one that works for you. I haven't extracted the memory manager into a standard library yet. It will be on my roadmap. This is the thing that will lead to that. I'll update it when I actually release it. And if BeepRain kept every recommendation, it would end up just like the Pandora stations, recycling the same over and over and over again. So I wired that thing up to BeepRain so I can strip its memory every time. And things like this are interesting because they help us save tokens, and they also just give us more control over what we're doing, but they aren't perfect. But luckily, perfection isn't required because we have this awesome, vast imagination we can basically take control of. And I don't know, I hope that inspires you to just sort of do some imaginary computing of your own. Thank you so much for hanging out and listening to me today. You can sign up for beta access to BeepRain if you go to this right here. I will only send you one email when the beta is ready. Spotify just has a thing where I can only let a certain number of people in at a time until it gets approved, and it hasn't yet. So if you want to, hit this up. Otherwise, thank you.